Hi everyone, welcome to Non-Boring History. I'm Annette Lang, the non-boring historian, perhaps not the only non-boring historian, but I'll grab it if I can. And I'd like to welcome today Dr. Tom Guiler, who's the Director of Museum Affairs for the Oneida, let me get this right, the Oneida Community Museum, the Oneida Community Mansion House, I'll get it right one of these days, in New York. This is following on from a piece that I just wrote for Non-Boring History about the Oneida community. So welcome, Tom. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your time.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Good. I wondered from the get-go, one thing I'm not clear on, what kinds of people tended to join the Oneida community? Were they working class, middle class, men, women? I mean, what did they have in common or not?
Well, I think it's a good point. And I think, one of the things I was just looking at today is one of the reasons that it is so successful and it is so it's around for so long is because the people who were attracted to Oneida for whatever reason were largely middle to upper middle class folks who were highly educated, did have some wealth that they brought to the community, and were very forward-thinking people. I can't stress enough that they were highly educated and skilled. And they did, for, whether it's by luck or by design, they recruited and brought people in who had a large, a wide skill set, from finance to industry to architecture, and actually horticulture as well. So they had a really wide range of skill sets, but the people that were attracted were largely upper middle class folks, almost, I think entirely white upper middle class folks.
Right. Were there any members of color that you're aware of?
Not that we're aware of at the moment, but I did know that the employees of the company, they did employ a diverse work set, including Irish folks at the time, as well as some people of color in the factory work.
And you're in upstate New York, so it's predominantly white from the get-go.
Very white, but during the 19th century, we're a hop, skip, and a jump from Peterborough, which was a major underground railroad station. So there are a lot of free people of color, formerly enslaved people, et cetera, around. So they are giving them employment.
And you've also got a lot of people in the community, I imagine, coming from abolitionism, or did they? I mean, I'm just assuming.
Yeah. So John Humphrey Noyes founded one of the first anti-slavery societies when he was in Connecticut, I believe. They're fervently abolitionists and join a large subset of people in upstate New York who are firmly abolitionists, from Rochester to Syracuse to Albany and beyond. So they're right in the middle of all of that.
And women's rights, clearly very important to them.
Absolutely. Women's rights, abolition, temperance. If it's basically the hotbed of reform, or as Whitney Cross said, the burned over district, which he meant to be the religious reform, but it can also mean sort of social and political reform as well.
Right. Were there many disaffected Oneidans? I saw that Charles Guiteau, the assassin of James Garfield, most notoriously, was disaffected, sued the community for back wages. And I know that was something that happened with the first Harmonist community in what's now New Harmony, Indiana, that people would say, oh, wait, I've been exploited, I'm going to sue. Did that happen? Were there beyond Guiteau?
Yeah, there were a few people that sued when they left forget the first name, but the band is the Purple Mills, the Mills folks. It was the quote unquote Mills War, that someone left the community and did not believe that they were given their current severance. So I think you see a lot of that. I think that's where people leaving, it's easy to leave. It's not a Jonestown situation by any means. You can definitely come and go as you please, but it's when that sort of the people leave when things get a little messy, because there's a formula in which they have devised to then sort of give someone a severance, basically, to leave the community. And some folks think that they didn't get their fair share. So that does happen. There's a number of examples of that, but by and large, the community has a pretty stable population of about 200 throughout its existence.
And I mean, these are pretty happy people with the way that they're living.
It's a good place to be. As I sort of say to people on tour, this is, it's a really big upper middle class home of a very different kind. They've got, it's nice to live here. They have nice furnishings. They have steam heat. They have basically what's a compostable toilet at this point. Really good food, and people are living really well here. So I think it's a comfortable life if you're into sort of the perfectionist creed that John Humphrey Noyes is selling.
Right, and that obviously is incredibly radical stuff, as I don't need to tell you, for the Victorian period. I know that Noyes's views on sex and on and the practice of sex at Oneida are subjects of fascination for the public. I mean, particularly when we're talking Victorians, it's kind of counter to what most people understand about them. How is it a challenge for you as a public historian to get across what the community was about?
I do think it's a challenge. There's a couple challenges I think that we have. The first, I think, when people come in the door and they think it's going to be a silverware museum because of the silverware company, I think they're like, oh, they want to get to that, right? So, but really, it's sort of been peeling back those layers. I also think it's difficult I think the biggest hurdle, I think, and the thing that I think we need to find a better way of doing and getting to the matter quickly is religion. I think there are people who don't have, to get to perfectionism, it's a deeper cut, if you will, of Protestantism. So you need to get there quicker because people don't have the religious knowledge that maybe perhaps they did. So even talking about the Second Great Awakening or the Reformation, even before that, and then getting into what that means is a challenge. I think another challenge that on that same note that I like is people not understanding why you would do this, right? Why would you enter into complex marriage? Why would you enter into a community? And I think it's telling people how powerful the idea of belief is, not only in the 19th century, that these people believed, everything about what John Humphrey Noyes was saying in terms of building, being part of this community, but also the belief can be a really powerful thing today, and so trying to get the relationship between like what today and then in the past in terms of belief is something that is a challenge. But I think once you can unlock that, people start to really understand the power of an ideology, the power of belief. So I think that's something that's a challenge. And the way, and also thinking about complex marriage, right? Talking about complex marriage with groups, it's hard to grasp. Like, we're so, interpolated in some ways into this idea of the nuclear family that people have a hard time understanding why you would be married to everyone else, right? And the way I explain that sometimes is that, Oneida is a story of a family, right? And even today, families come in all different shapes and sizes, right? So if you think about it like that, that's the way we sort of talk about it with children, is like a big family. And I think that kind of resonates with people because not everyone lives in a nuclear family, right? I mean, we know that from demographics. So if you can say like, oh, what's your family look like? Like, well, I live with my grandma and my mom and dad, or I live with my mom and stepfather. And you can say the same thing about Oneida. And, with children, especially, you can say like, well, what would it be like if you had 100 moms and 100 dads and you're running around with 50 cousins, right? And then they start to sort of get it a little bit more. But I think those are like sort of the biggest challenges, sort of like getting people into the religious landscape of the 19th century, talking about what the idea of family was, and also the power of belief. I think the three big things.
Yeah, I mean, and belief is an issue, of course, for historians, most of whom bring a very secular mindset to trying to understand faith, and I'm among those. I write about religion, and yeah, I mean, it's a big challenge. I mean, the other thing, and this, we live in very strange times, as we always have, perhaps, but people are very present-minded. One of the things that historians do that I think the public has a tough time getting its head around is essentially our cultural relativism, our tendency to try to understand the past on its own terms, to try to understand how people were motivated within this larger context. And I've already kind of written about this in writing about my visit to the Oneida Mansion. I'm struggling. How do I get this across? Because for a lot of people, they're going to read something on Wikipedia about John Humphrey Noyes having reserved the 12 and 13-year-olds for himself. And is that even true, by the way? Is there evidence for that? Some, maybe. And that's just going to be the end of the story. And what I'm hoping to do is to try to get people to think about that cultural context. And I mean, what do we say to people who are quite rightly kind of horrified, but at the same time, historians it's just not how we tend to go at these things.
I think part of it is I think a lot of the talking about the past is in any context is sort of remembering that people are human and people are complex, right? Which is hard when you're on an hour tour. So I think, it's easy to go online, right? You just type in Oneida Community and then you start finding all the salacious things of the community, which may or may not be true. So that's another challenge, right? Is being like, okay, yeah, what you read is, there are some nuggets of truth in that, but you also need to know sort of the whole story. And the story is, pardon the pun, it's really complicated. It's really complex. So, it's getting to that with people. It's sort of like, okay, that's what you came in with, your preconceived notions, but what if I said this? What if you got to know sort of the backstory, the context, and then humanizing these people? And also part of that, I think, is just that, is they're people, and they're not all John Humphrey Noyes, right? There are 199 other people living here who've all come with their own preconceived notions, with their own ideas. And I think boiling it down to the salacious parts is really, it's selling the story short, because while that's certainly, there are things that are shocking and controversial, there's other things that are incredibly amazing and wholesome and great about the community as well.
Yeah, that's and that's something that, right now in the 2020s, we're struggling with trying to, as historians, to restore nuance. Conversation, even on subjects that people say, well, there isn't nuance. Well, there's always nuance. And I'm so glad that you repeated what I'm always telling my readers is the historian's motto, and that is, it's complicated. Yeah. And that's so then that's a lot of our challenges. People's attention spans are short, but if they really want to understand something, they've got to work on that. So
it's the challenge, but it's also the fun of it, right? I mean, that's figuring people out, and figuring that out is part of the fun, at least for us.
We just keep, that's it. We answer questions with more questions, right? So the again, I looked on Wikipedia, because that's what people will do, and it said that the community ends when John Humphrey Noyes flees to Canada. Gonna guess that's more complicated too. What happened?
So when the community ends in 1881, John Humphrey Noyes has been gone already for a little bit. And then the community here that just remains votes to, first they end complex marriage, and then they vote in 1880 to disband as a communal society. And it's taken by vote, and it's 199-1. And the only person that dissented was Sewell Newhouse, who was the inventor of the animal traps that made them so famous as well as wealthy. But what happens then is sort of the way I've been thinking about it recently is, when the breakup happens, everything changes, and yet nothing changes. In some ways, everything changes because they stop the strict communalism that goes on, right? They're entering the outside world for the first time. This means a couple different things. People are leaving. Factions go to California. They go to New York. They go to New Haven and Connecticut. They do disperse, some of them, but a lot of them stay right here, right? And in some ways is what, we talk about as like the second utopia, or like the second phase of the community, is because though they're now living in nuclear families for the first time, they have their own apartments, they are employed in the outside world, nothing changes because the great majority of people stay right in the area, right? Instead of having the communalism then turns to basically being employed by the company. A lot of the people who signed the breakup agreement, which it has a formula for, how much you'd be paid out at the end of this whole thing, a lot of them take it in stock for the company. So this communalism then becomes sort of almost, it's really a form of welfare capitalism that's fed by the trap company and what becomes the silverware company. I also say nothing changes because a lot of people never left the mansion house. The mansion house just evolved like it had throughout its existence. So a lot of the individual sleeping rooms were then combined into small apartments for various uses. Communal meals were still taken in the dining room. Employment pretty much stayed the way it was. They remained to be the managers of the silverware company. They became the managers of the silk company. Nothing really changed, but at the same time, everything changed because they no longer are leading this extremely religious lifestyle. They're living in nuclear families. And, it may sound flip to us and sort of trivial, but they're using money. There are these stories of people like not really understanding what money is, and being like sort of having trepidation about doing this. So they are really entering the outside world. So that's a huge change. But at the same time, their surroundings are still familiar. They're still there with what's become then a lot of cousins, aunts and uncles, moms and dads. It's kind of amazing the way it didn't end. I think that's one thing I want to stress is it didn't end, it evolved.
Well, I mean, you've summed it up really, really well. And I'm a complete neophyte to this, but I was really struck by how I had seen it as they go from socialism to capitalism in 1881. And it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. When I taught this as part of the survey, and then reading about them now and reading your work about the Oneidas, I was struck by how even as socialists, they were very capitalist. Or at least they were very entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
And so the business end of things, they already had a head start on. They were sort of, steered that way almost by their own success as producers of goods. Is that fair?
Well, that's what I say. I was just teaching a lecture on this the other day, and it's like, well, yes, they call themselves Bible communists, but that only pertains to their home basis of economy. Outside of that, they're stone cold capitalists because they are really good at business for the most part. I mean, they're of course subject to the ups and downs of the volatile 19th century economy, but by and large, they know what they're doing. They're good at advertising. They have a great product and they know how to do it. I do think that after the breakup, I think due to sort of like being, going into the outside world, a lot of the people who were running the businesses in the 1850s are older now. And it does go downhill.
Yeah.
They can't quite figure out what's going on in the economy in the 1880s and 90s. And that's until John Humphrey Noyes' Stirpicalt son, Pierpont Burt Noyes, takes over the company. And he has the same sort of visionary spirit that his father did. It's just a secular version of it. So basically what Pierpont does is he takes the community spirit of, taking care of one another, sharing things in common, all the high tide raises all ships, etc. And he applies it to the company. So basically you get a version of welfare capitalism right here in Oneida. So we're talking about the company supports, which is crazy if you think about it. Like, okay, they support every church in Sherrill, which is the company town, right? So they go from this like idea of this very interesting Second Great Awakening religious movement perfectionism to supporting the Baptist church down the road, right? They support the schools. They have employee recreation centers.
But that's something that then, Henry Ford does, the Cadburys in England do. Are they connected? Is this coincidence? Are there deeper roots to all these things?
No, there's no coincidence. I mean, I think Oneida, because of the history, brings its own personal spin on it, but they're very cognizant of what happened in Pullman. In the company. So like, yes, they are seeing what Henry Ford's doing. They're seeing what this is doing, but they're very interested by Pullman and how Pullman starts this company town, but then goes really wrong, right? This is where you have the violent strikes. What Oneida does is says, okay, that's a good idea, except we're not going to own anything. right? The workers, the city of Sherrill, which they, set up for the workers, is run by the workers of the factory. You're not, there's no company store, there's no sort of the indentured servitude that you would have in some of these company towns. It's completely sort of separate. That doesn't mean that the company's not the biggest benefactor of these things, but by no means is there like the head of the company is also the mayor. Like that, they're totally separate entities.
Honestly, I could talk to you all day about this and you'll be relieved to know I won't. But there's so many questions come out of this. Was there conflict? Some some community members were more equal than others in the aftermath of the breakup. Pippa Noyes obviously makes a lot more money, has a bigger house than other people. Is there conflict over this that you've picked up on?
There's a divide. I wouldn't say conflict. I definitely think that what has happened though is the area around the mansion house is known as Kenwood. And that is definitely sort of for the managers. And you see this throughout the 20th century in oral history interviews and things. Is like, okay, this is where the managers live. This is where like the main bulk of the descendants live. And then across the road, or the bridge rather, is Sherrill, and that was where the workers are. So there's a divide there. I wouldn't say there was conflict because I think by and large, the people who worked for the company were happy. I think that they were very well taken care of. The job security was great. The pay was, for the time, fantastic. But at the same time, I think there was definitely a social divide. And I think that's best seen with sort of, you can see it, and I think I talked about this a little bit in my article, you can see it in the architecture. Yeah. The architecture in Kenwood is done by architects, some very well known, and then the ones in Sherrill are, contractor houses. Not to say that they're not nice homes, but they're just not of the level. And I think you can see sort of that management divide that happens in the 20th century and then really gets cranking. And I think really sort of this is what leads to the downfall of the company in the 1980s, is when executives stop having salaries that are comparable to the workers, and start having, basically like any other Fortune 500 company, people having enormous signing bonuses and raises and things like that, and things get out of control. And I think that's where you see some resentment today, is that sort of management and employees being comparable to them being completely sort of different. And
did a lot of, I know that in the 30s some things changed, and we don't have time to go into that, but lots of things going on in the 30s, including of course the New Deal bringing in more kind of federal responsibility for unemployment, social security, that kind of thing. But did we, by the time the factory closed, was any of that kind of corporate welfare still there? You had pensions, sure, but were there still social clubs, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So they stopped funding that. But it was a slow decline in some of those things. But yeah, they stopped funding a lot of that stuff. But the city then picked it up. So, those things kind of go by the wayside, but then sort of the municipal services pick it up. So actually, one of the best examples of that is that the company owned the mansion house. It was a private museum for some, basically a residence and an event space for the company. And in 1987, they had sort of jettisoned it and it became its own nonprofit. That's not to say it still wasn't supported by the company. They were giving hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, but they weren't supporting it to the degree that they were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, for sure. So
sort of a frog boiled in water thing. The closure is like a bit like a frog being slowly boiled in water. These things are disappearing, and it's happening over such a long term. And the only really stunning thing is when it just ends. The factory's gone, the pension's
when they just lay off everybody.
The job's gone, everybody's laid off. And well, what do you hope, very quickly, because I know you've got things to do, but what do you hope that museum visitors today will take away from the experience of visiting the Oneida Mansion?
Well, I hope they come away. I think what we always hope is that they come away with sort of an inspiration to to make the world a better place. Whether however that is, if that's creating your own utopian community, or just deciding to pick up that litter on the ground, is something that I hope people feel inspired and empowered to make change in the world, much like the first perfectionist did.
That's thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate your time. And again, I have a million questions I could ask. This is driving me up the wall, but I'm going to stop it there. Thank you again.
Well, you know where to find me.
I do. And